In February of 2020, wrestling action figure history would be changed forever when AEW announced that they would be partnering with Jazwares to create wrestling action figures of their talent. Now, this was a very important announcement for a lot of different reasons, but in this video today, we're going to be discussing the lore and the importance behind the first ever Kenny Omega action figure. And the reasons behind the importance of the Kenny Omega action figures do carry over into other talents as well. But in this video specifically, we're going to be talking about Kenny Omega. Now, it's no secret that Kenny Omega is probably the most famous or most well-known wrestler outside of WWE, and definitely in the years leading up to AEW. But Kenny Omega really rose to fame in New Japan, becoming a major star and known for his high-flying style and technical prowess, and wrestling fans started to take notice. Now, the big problem with talents outside of WWE getting famous and being really well-known is there's no Mattel standing on the sidelines ready to make action figures of these guys when they become really relevant and in the main spotlight. Now, Kenny Omega is not the only one that has fell victim to this. I just personally think that he is the poster child for said problem, and we're going to dive into all of that lore here today and explain to you everything about the importance and how epic the AEW Jazwares Kenny Omega figures are. If you're not living under a rock, WWE is not the only wrestling product available out there for you. In the year 2024, there are so many wrestling promotions around the planet that there is something out there for absolutely anybody. WWE is not the only kid on the playground nowadays. Now, he may be the biggest and baddest, or the most well-known, or have the most money, or be the most successful, but there's plenty of product out there that anybody can enjoy if you're a wrestling fan. Now, where the problem arises as a wrestling action figure collector is if there is a talent outside of WWE, and nowadays AEW, which we'll get into, if there's a really cool wrestler or a famous wrestler across the planet that you want to have an action figure of, in most cases, there is nobody out there that is going to make an action figure of that wrestler. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because especially over the last 5-6 years or so, they have continued. There have been third-party companies and things that step in and create these action figures to fill these holes. But during the time that Kenny Omega was on the rise, there was no Jazwares out there ready to create a Kenny Omega fully posable action figure for your wrestling action figure collection. So what do you do when you're a wrestling action figure collector and there's a wrestler out there that you want in figure form, but there's no major company out there to make an official one? You got to dip into the creativity bucket and go out there and make your own custom version. So that is what I and a ton of other WWE and wrestling action figure collectors had to do back in the day with Kenny Omega. So much, in fact, that I created an entire video on my YouTube channel dedicated to creating a Kenny Omega from scratch. The parts that you would use. I think I went into the budget to make the figure and everything you would need to create your own Kenny Omega Elite action figure. So here's the rundown on the Kenny Omega Custom Elite action figure. You would always start off with a DDP hairpiece. This was really the simplest way you could do so without having to sculpt your own hair. So you would buy a DDP Elite 36 or some sort of Elite DDP. You'd heat up the head sculpt, peel the hairpiece off, and then you'd have to go out and buy a version of Daniel Bryan's Elite figures and pop his head off. For whatever reason, the Mattel WWE Elite Daniel Bryan's around this time, there was a few different options, but they had a little bit of likeness to Kenny Omega. You could decide what kind of facial hair you wanted based on the head sculpt you chose, and then it was all about dribbling down the hair and super gluing it to the top of the head sculpt. From there, you could either use the DDP base body, or you could go out there and get some other Elite bodies, throw some kick pads on there, and voila, you had yourselves a Kenny Omega, or at least a makeshift one. Go over to Curb Stomp City, buy you some Kenny Omega decals, and voila, everybody was making Bullet Club decals and Bullet Club Kenny Omega custom figures. It legitimately seemed like every other day there was a new Kenny Omega formula or somebody coming out of the woodworks to create a brand new Kenny Omega. Different head sculpts, different formulas, different torsos. Everybody was out there trying to make the best version of a Kenny Omega, and that kind of became the meta of making a Kenny Omega in the community. But the base was DDP hairpiece, Daniel Bryan head sculpt, ripped up torso, give him some kick pads, and call it a day. And if you wanted an official Kenny Omega head sculpt, this was practically impossible. There was a few different people that were head makers, but what they would do was take this really old statue of Kenny Omega, shrink down the head sculpt, and then people would custom paint it and everything. I never personally liked this option because I thought the head sculpt looked really derpy, so I always found that the DDP way with the Daniel Bryan head sculpt was the best way to possibly make a Kenny Omega head sculpt. And this was before 3D printing and things like that. That was not a very well-known thing, if at all. I don't even think that was a thing back then. And unless you were hand sculpting a Kenny Omega head sculpt or buying one of those shrunken down head sculpts, there was really no way to get a official, or at least a close to resembling an official Kenny Omega head sculpt for your action figure. And again, Kenny Omega is not the only victim of this. There have been countless other wrestlers that have been very, very famous that have not been able to get an official figure for a very long time, And Kenny Omega, again, was just one of the more popular ones through this era. I bet there's a whole generation of kids that grew up maybe wanting a Kenny Omega, and they would see these customs. And the only way to get a Kenny Omega was to make your own custom one. Follow these videos you found online or something like that. I also think it would be fair to throw the Young Bucks in there as well. Matt Jackson, Nick Jackson. There was also a meta to creating their figures as well. It was tracking down some old Drew McIntyre basic head sculpts, throwing them onto some Tyler Breeze bodies, or, you know, trying to get some tassels of some kind from Ultimate Warrior and things like that. That was also sort of a meta that you had to follow in order to make your own Young Buck figures to pair with your Kenny Omega. That was such a unique time in wrestling action figure collecting and the community itself, because it seemed like everybody was kind of making their own or finding their own way to create Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks for their wrestling figure feds or their shelf display or different areas like that. You can find a bunch of different formulas online and things like that, and you know, it comes down to sort of your own personal preference in the matter, but there were only a few real customs that looked that good. I had to use one in my pick fed for so long, and I didn't even really like the way he looked. The one I used at Hell's Gate in my pick fed and the way he ran this championship. And I make the joke all the time that for all these years, I used this worthless custom Kenny Omega, or I used these versions of a Kenny Omega so many years, and now the Kenny Omega figures are the best they've ever been, and they're not even being utilized on MDT television. But then in 2020, we were all saved by AEW and Jazwares as they stepped up, and we got an official toy-making company that creates official licenses that would be stepping in to make AEW action figures. We were going to get brand new figures of Chris Jericho, the Young Buck, Cody Rhodes, Kenny Omega. And this was a very big groundbreaking announcement. Now, were the figures perfect? By no stretch were they perfect. There was plenty of things to complain about. When the figures first came out, they were super pale. They had the factory errors. Even that first Kenny Omega wasn't the greatest ever, but I don't think anybody really gave a damn at the time because we were just excited to get a Kenny Omega. Now, they did right the wrong. They did have the updated skin tone, which was also not very good. They had the Kenny Omega with the ring, which was also very pale, even though the gears were great. And those first few Kenny Omegas weren't even that good. Not to mention the skin tone and the head sculpt wasn't the greatest, but even the legs weren't the best. They were a little loose, but it was a fine starting point for what we had, and, you know, we could always improve from there. But then you had the unmatched Series number 1 Kenny Omega. This figure right here shattered the mold and created a new standard for wrestling action figures. This unmatched Series 1 Kenny Omega is one of my favorite wrestling action figures of all time. I would probably put it up there with the Supreme as one of my favorite wrestling action figures of all time as well. But this was the first before we got all the different Kenny Omega versions we would get from AEW and Jazwares. It had an improved skin tone, it had improved likeness, serious head sculpt, great attire, and then we would get the unrivaled Series 4 with the yelling head sculpt. We would get some promo gear Kenny Omega. We had the blood and guts, and then we got the Supreme Edition Kenny Omega. Butterfly joints introduced, different gears, different head sculpts, the Walmart exclusive that had the jeans for promo gear Kenny Omega, and this would ultimately rule the day for Kenny Omega action figures. No longer were we subjected to these terrible custom Kenny Omega figures. We could finally fully pose around these figures without paint chipping, without painting a head cast and creating our own Kenny Omega figures. We no longer had to buy DDP hair pieces and glue them to the top of Daniel Bryan head sculpts, putting them on these myriad of different formulas to try and create a Kenny Omega action figure. We had a fully posable, fully functional, super articulated, super detailed version of Kenny Omega to finally run around, pose, and display in our action figure collections. You could do your fantasy matchups with Roman Reigns, AJ Styles, Seth Rollins, Finn Balor. All of these things were now possible because of these Kenny Omega figures we were getting from AEW and Jazwares. Now, outside of the AEW Unmatched Series 10 Kenny Omega, we haven't had a Kenny Omega figure in a little bit, but I truly believe if they never released another Kenny Omega action figure ever again, and I do believe there will be more, and maybe one day we'll get a coveted Elite Kenny Omega officially from Mattel. Maybe he jump ship and we finally get an Ultimate Edition Kenny Omega one day. But if that day never came, I think we would be completely okay with the selection of Kenny Omega action figures that we have at our disposal. Between the Unmatched, the Unrivaled, the Supreme, they no longer have to make any more Kenny Omegas because we got our first, and that's all we needed. Gone were the days of the ugly customs. Gone were the days of having to sort of Frankenstein together some form of a Kenny Omega action figure. And thank God for that. And I'll always thank Jazwares for that. But I think that about wraps up all of my thoughts on the Kenny Omega action figure lore and how important he is to wrestling action figure collectors and everything like that. I want to get on here and talk about this a little bit. I always thought it was an interesting topic. And I think everything that I said in this video remains true. I'd love to know all of your thoughts thoughts down in the comment section below, what you think of the Kenny Omega figures. Were you around back in the day when we had to make those customs? And I do believe that, again, you could make the same case for some other talents. And there's probably talents to this day, right now, that are out there that don't have their own official figure that are up there in popularity. But nonetheless, man, huge shout out to our Patreon members, man. I appreciate all of you. Thank you guys so very much for all of your support. You guys are unbelievable. Always appreciate you guys so very much, man. You guys are absolutely incredible. I appreciate your support. Hope everybody out there is having a Merry Christmas, man. Posting this 2 days before Christmas, but we should have some cool videos going up in the next 2 days, man. Hopefully, Action Figure Surgery episode 100 will be out on Christmas Day. But I'm getting the hell out, man. Hope you guys did enjoy. Leave me your thoughts down below. I'll see you guys next time. Have a blessed one, and I'll catch you guys later.